Christine Schneider, the Visceral Voice.
Welcome to the Visceral Voice podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Every 2 weeks on this podcast, I talk with voice specialists, manual therapists, health specialists, psychotherapists, movement practitioners, and professional voice users about voice science, function, medication, movement, puberty and aging, and everything in between. I am on a quest, not only to become a better manual therapist, but also to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, and a manual therapist. Join me every 2 weeks as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help restore, regain, and create happiness and success in your vocal journey. From his studio in the heart of Midtown, Mike Ruckles maintains one of the city's busiest voice studios, dedicated to elite performers from the worlds of Broadway, film and TV, rock, pop, opera, jazz, and beyond. He is privileged to work with some of the finest singers and storytellers in the industry, numbering among them Tony and Grammy winners, Oscar nominees, and Fortune 500 executives. As a singing voice specialist, he also works closely with some of the city's most distinguished otolaryngologists and speech pathologists in the rehabilitation of injured singers. Mike has taught on the voice faculty of NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, the University of Northern Colorado, yay, the New York Film Academy, and the Broadway Theater Project. More recently, he served as the Associate Music Director for the Tony-winning musical, A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder. In this episode, Mike is going to debunk some daily pre-show consumption superstitions. He's going to tell us what's good, what's bad, what's healthy or potentially unhealthy. And then we're going to move on to vocal myth versus truth. Here you are. I'm thrilled to bring you my conversation with Mike Ruckles. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Christine. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so thrilled to have you here. So we have so much in common.
I know.
We're both from Colorado.
You know what? I forgot that.
You did? Yeah, we're both from Colorado. We both play French horn.
No, we do not.
I thought you played French horn.
Oh, no. No. I played French horn disastrously for about 3 weeks. That's amazing. I have such respect for you because it is, I think, the most difficult instrument. But if you could see my lips, you would go, oh, yeah, he could never be a French horn player.
A trumpet player?
Maybe. I would work on the double reeds. That was my thing.
Oh, okay. Amazing.
But only, this was all like 2-week stints, in school.
Okay, right, because you were picking up different instruments.
No, I'm a pianist through and through.
Ah, amazing. I am not, although I do have my minor in it, which is kind of a joke.
I'm truly just obsessed that you thought I was a French horn player. I love that.
I don't know where I got the idea, but I did.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're both parents.
We are.
I do know that.
Indeed.
We both love learning. We consider ourselves lifelong learners.
Yes, indeed.
We have that in common. We both work with many of the same clients.
Uh-huh.
We like to geek out over vocal pedagogy and anatomy.
That we do.
So much in common. So the crazy thing is that we have all this in common, Mike, and yet we have never met.
Yes, and that is a decidedly New York phenomenon, isn't it?
Yes, we need to remedy this.
Yeah, you have people in your life who you feel like you know so well, you admire, and you are communicating and collaborating with every day, but it just so happens that you've never met in person.
Yeah, it's so crazy. Okay, so we need to figure that out.
Right after this, we'll take taxis and we'll meet at a midway point.
Yes. Awesome. So we're going to get into some superstitious debunking and some myth versus truth.
Great.
Mike is going to set us all straight. But before we do that, if you want to just kind of share a little about how you got into vocal pedagogy and your teaching method.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit odd because neither of my parents are particularly musical, but I was obsessed with the voice from an early age. listening, singing, or performing all the time. Other kids were out playing, and I was inside glued to my tape player. Do you remember cassette tapes, Christine?
Of course I do.
Or I was glued to the piano. Anyway, as high school came to an end, my parents sort of assumed I'd major in piano performance, which made sense because I'd always been in lessons or doing piano competitions. But I felt very strongly that that wasn't my path. My passion was the voice, and I was going to be a voice major. And rather naively, I didn't quite understand that a vocal degree meant classical voice. Even as I was preparing Vittoria mio core, somehow that escaped me. Anyway, fast forward to my sophomore year of college. Happily, I'd really fallen in love with classical voice and had committed myself to it. And even as I was pursuing my guilty pleasure music theater singing on the side. But I left most of my lessons very frustrated and fatigued. I didn't really understand why I wasn't progressing. And as most students do, I thought it was me. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I wasn't cut out to be a singer. I'd have a great vocal day and I would have no idea why, you know? Mm-hmm. And then during that sophomore year of college in a master class, I made more progress in 15 minutes with a stranger than I'd made in years of training. Mm. And it was my first taste of functional voice training, and it really lit me on fire. And I began seeking out all of the transformative teaching and teachers that I could across the country, really. And I had a bit of a rude awakening to the reality that I was passionate not so much about creating my own art, but about being a conduit for that kind of transformative work in other singers. So I went on to teach at the University of Northern Colorado in their wonderful music theater department for 8 years before my amazing wife, Lindsay, and I made the big move east to New York City. Here, my private studio is comprised of about 80% Broadway and music theater professionals, and that remaining 20% is sort of a wonderfully eclectic mix of pop and rock artists, opera singers, jazz, and folk. I love that variety.
Yeah.
I also work, as you know, as an SVS or singing voice specialist, which is someone who works as part of a collaborative team with otolaryngologists and speech pathologists in the rehabilitation of injured singers. And that's something I'm really passionate about. So here in the city, I work closely with the voice teams at Weill Cornell and NYU, among others. So that's me.
Yay. That is so great.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to talk about superstitions. So I'm going to call this the Superstitious Daily Pre-Show Consumption Debunk. A very long name. So if you can tell us if this is good or bad, or potentially healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to keep in mind as we go about some myth busting today is that it isn't about shaming or discrediting anyone who has held these beliefs. In fact, I think we want to look at why these ideas or methods came to be and why they proliferated in the first place, Though there may not be a factual or physiological truth to them, there may likely be a strong perceptual truth for the voice user. Mm-hmm. And that's what I find very interesting.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the first one is Dr. Pepper.
I actually hear this a lot, and often it's Mountain Dew or maybe just seltzer. First, I think we have to remember, and I think it's important to point out that anything we eat or drink does not pass over the folds themselves. Mm-hmm. Food and drink, hopefully are headed down the esophagus versus the laryngopharynx and the trachea. So sipping water is great for hydration, but it will not hydrate the folds topically as it doesn't reach them. Mm-hmm. My impression is that singers are responding to that powerful feeling of carbonation in the oropharynx, Mm-hmm. I think that fizzing gives us the impression that it's stripping or clearing phlegm, but I think that's perhaps unlikely. That said, as with many of these things we're going to talk about, I'm sure it may be just a placebo effect for you. But if it feels good and puts you in good headspace to perform, why not?
Yeah.
Personally, I might be a bit concerned about burping on stage. But
right. Or the sugar consumption.
Yeah, that as well.
How it will affect my body over the long run.
Indeed. Okay,
the next one is pineapple juice.
This one definitely has merit. I often recommend pineapple to my clients because it contains high levels of bromelain, which is an anti-inflammatory enzyme. A great and natural way to get a systemic deswelling effect in the body. The concentration levels of bromelain actually are highest in the stem of the pineapple, but I don't know many people who enjoy eating pineapple stem. So now I have questions about the efficacy of drinking or gargling with pineapple juice just before singing. I'm not sure that we can expect to get any kind of topical deswelling benefit to the walls of the throat with pineapple, if that's what people are using it for. It's possible. But I think really what we would want to use it for is for that systemic deswelling effect. And it is. Bromelain is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So maybe consuming it or drinking it just as a lifestyle choice as opposed to
Sure.
right before a show or
Sure, absolutely. And olives also very high in bromelain.
olives.
Yep.
Okay.
So Hawaiian pizza. That's what we're talking about here.
Yes. Well, I love olives, so yay. Okay, how about Mucinex?
Okay. So we're talking about an expectorant here. And if you need to loosen congestion, guaifenesin, which is the primary ingredient, works very well for that. It is, however, very drying. So you really want to offset that use with lots of water. And I think be clear about which formulation you're taking and for what purpose. For example, does it have a cough suppressant or not?
Right. And so we're also talking about someone who does this before every show.
Ooh, no.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So if someone's feeling something, they have a little cold going on or something, that's completely different. But I'm talking about all of these as something that they do in a long run, 8 shows a week. They take it before every show.
I would be highly concerned about that.
Yeah, me too.
I think we'd want to look then at what are the symptoms? What do you feel like it is addressing? And how could we address that another way?
Mm-hmm. How about an oral inhaler?
Okay, so first I would definitely want to find out if it was prescribed to the singer and for what purpose. I think we have to be cautious with any steroidal inhalers particularly because of the potential for yeast overgrowth, resulting dryness, and we also see weakness in the folds with long-term use of oral inhalers, the steroids. But if you're asthmatic, you may not have an option. You need, quote unquote, the bellows of the lungs, and you need them to be free and functioning.
Yeah. How about alcoholic beverages?
I think we can all agree this is not a great idea, but I do have a student who never steps out on stage without taking a shot of bourbon whiskey. He swears by it. So in the words of, Sheryl Crow, I say, if it makes you happy, it can't be that bad. Is alcohol drying and potentially irritating to the pharynx? Yes, it is. But if the placebo effect is working for you, as a voice teacher, I'm going to pick my battles. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about a shot and not, heavy drinking,
yeah,
or a gulp, I can perhaps get behind that.
I do think that some people actually can transit, or they do transition from being on a beta blocker like Inderal. And the way they kind of transition and getting off of beta blockers is through having something like a shot. And then they try to transition their way from that as the show continues on into nothing.
Yeah, if we're using it as a means to manage anxiety, if that's the purpose of it, then I think we've got a bigger problem. I would much prefer them stay on propranolol or Inderal or something that is a beta blocker versus alcohol for that function. But better yet, talk therapy.
Absolutely. How about a spoonful of honey?
Yeah, I think that's harmless. And if you like that sensation of a slightly coated throat, you'll probably be really into this. I don't personally prefer that feeling of a coated throat, but, better yet, if it's Manuka honey and we can get some of that antibacterial benefit, I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Entertainer's Secret.
I like Entertainer's Secret. It's glycerin based and one of the better sprays marketed to singers. I find it hard to locate in stores. I think I have to order it online when I find it, but it's great.
And throat coat tea?
Yeah, I don't really have any real problems there. I think we're talking with throat coat about slippery elm, marshmallow root, licorice root, which, we don't want to overdo licorice root, but a cup of tea isn't going to create issues.
Do you think it matters whether someone has it before a performance or after a performance?
I don't. It's not going to soothe your folds. As we talked about, it doesn't pass through the larynx. Mm-hmm. But many singers love that feeling of throat coat, especially if they're working through drainage or infection.
Yeah. Ricola.
Ricola. So, Christine, I have a confession to make. During our Broadway run of A Gentleman's Guide, there were baskets of Ricola everywhere backstage at the Kerr. And I confess, I used to do as a voice teacher, I used to do regular sweeps backstage and get rid of them. It's true. I was the one. It was me. Go into any Broadway rehearsal room or go backstage in any theater, and you'll spot these wicker baskets of Ricola supplied by, very well-intentioned stage management. The issue with Ricola is that it contains menthol, which is a tissue irritant and very drying, which begs the question, why does Ricola contain menthol? And the answer is that menthol produces a cooling, numbing effect. And I think for singers, it's ironic, but that very irritation of the soft tissue helps them to feel the air column more distinctly, creating enhanced proprioception or awareness of the vocal tract. But this is all sadly the result of irritation that menthol produces in the soft tissue. So for me, Ricola is a big no, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. And it's everywhere. And I find they even are sort of marketing it to singers, which I think is somewhat irresponsible.
Yeah. I was on the Ricola train and I reached out to you and I was like, wait, what's going on with Ricola? Because it's what I take when I have a cold and it's what helps my throat. And then you explained it to me and I shifted immediately, but I was really grateful to have your advice and expertise on that because I had them in my studio and I was having them myself. I was still performing and I had them. And
most of these singers are quite surprised by that. They really enjoy Ricola. And I get it actually. I'll confess that sometimes I do enjoy singing with a Listerine strip on the back of my tongue. Mm-hmm. And I don't do that in performance, but I enjoy it because it gives you a sense of, like I said, enhanced proprioception. You can feel the walls and the palate. It gives you more awareness back there where we ordinarily don't have a lot of proprioception. And so I think that's what singers are drawn to. They feel very open, but that openness, again, is being produced by that irritation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much for that information.
Yeah.
Aloe vera water.
Yeah, I think aloe water is just fine. But again, it's really not going to serve a function topically in the throat, probably. Its benefits are going to be systemic. So it's touted for its benefits to, the skin and for aiding digestion. Actually, there's some evidence that the compounds in aloe vera help control acid production in the stomach. So it could actually be worth exploring if you're actively dealing with GERD. That could be a good choice.
Mm-hmm. And what about essential oils like Breathe from doTERRA or eucalyptus in a personal steamer?
This is a tricky one. I have not used them myself, not for vocal purposes at any rate. There certainly aren't any studies to support their use, although I do have singers who really swear by them. I think there is the misconception, too, that essential oils are harmless because they may be natural, when in fact they're very concentrated, and I think we have to use them very responsibly. Eucalyptus, some of these things like Breathe from doTERRA, surprisingly, though they may be marketed to, open up the sinuses, or they may even be marketed to singers, they often are, again, they may have a soft tissue irritant in them. So I think you have to really do your research. I think you'd want to listen to your body if you're exploring that and really, is it helping you or is it creating an issue?
Yeah. Okay, so let's move into some myth versus truth.
Sure.
How about myth versus truth?
Okay.
Ground baby aspirin will ease a sore throat.
Ground baby aspirin.
Gargling it.
Yeah. Again, we're talking about topical use of aspirin. You might do better to get, I'm thinking like the baby children's like liquid, Tylenol or aspirin, and gargle with that. But I think the problem is, if we're talking about singing, we do not want to be using any kind of analgesic. We do not want to be numbing anything in the instrument. If you're feeling pain, you need to be feeling that pain, unfortunately. It is the body's way of telling you what's up, right? Yeah. And if you're experiencing the kind of throat pain that is severe enough that you would consider taking, Tylenol or Advil or something of that variety, I think you probably should not be singing.
Mm-hmm. So along similar lines, there is something that people are using, and they're calling it the magic mouthwash for allergies and for acid reflux. This is what the recipe is. It's mix 1 tablespoon of liquid children's Benadryl with 1 tablespoon of liquid Mylanta and gargle, and it will take down the swelling and acid in the throat. Myth or truth?
Well, that certainly does sound magical. I actually, weirdly, this has never come across my studio. It's not on my radar. I have not had a student talk to me about the quote unquote magic mouthwash. I'm kind of impressed by whoever came up with this. I think for me as a teacher, I really want to look at what is the root cause of these symptoms. This feels like sort of a Band-Aid. And I think I would prefer the student be focused on what is the source of your reflux? Is it lifestyle? Is it to do with the pyloric sphincter? Is it overproduction of acid? What may it be? And how could we address that? And then, as we know, acid reflux can tend to create this vicious cycle with drainage, where we get acid spilling up the throat and then we have drainage coming down, and they sort of feed each other. So I totally get why somebody would, concoct this magic mouthwash to nip that in the bud, that cycle. But I think I would encourage someone to really, get to your doctor or talk with your ENT or your teacher about what is at the root cause of this.
Mm-hmm. So important. Find out what the cause is.
Mm-hmm. And I sympathize, because GERD is really a complex issue, and it can be, as you know, Christine, it can be caused by so many factors, and usually it's not just caused by one.
Yeah. Myth or truth? The tip of the tongue should rest on the upper alveolar ridge.
Okay. I think this would depend on what activity we're engaged in. Are we talking about resting the tip of the tongue on the alveolar ridge during speech or song? That would be pretty crazy, unless you're momentarily producing, a consonant like n, d, t. But the resting position for the tongue is actually against the roof of the mouth. So I suppose it would follow that the tip of the tongue would then be on the alveolar ridge. But if you're trying to maintain that during speech and singing, I think that's pretty unnatural.
Yeah, I get this question all the time.
Really?
So at rest, when people are just hanging out with their mouth closed,
Mm-hmm.
Some people are told the lower and some people are told the upper. And they say, Christine, where do I keep it? And I say, what's comfortable for you?
I think that's a fair answer, honestly. And but I would posit that the people who have been told that it should be lower, that's probably a bit of a classical voice bias. When I was in college, I was always told that, as the baritone Thomas Hampson says, the tongue should be a rug lying flat on the floor of the mouth. I can't quite agree with that. And not for anybody, but particularly if you're going to be singing, for a man above your passaggio, above E and F, that's going to really create problems. Maybe for a low baritone, you could perhaps get away with that for a while. But I think there is a classical bias towards this idea of a low, flat tongue. That's changing and that's shifting, I think, as we look at more research and we see what classical singers are really actually doing with their tongue versus what they think they're doing. Mm-hmm. But yes, it should be where it feels comfortable. I don't think we need to obsess.
Yeah. Myth or truth? You should be relaxed and free of all tension.
Yeah, when I was an undergrad voice major, I had this very idea that the best sound would be produced when I released all tension from the body and the instrument. And that sounds, just lovely on paper. But it brings up this interesting conversation about effort versus tension. Any endeavor requires the firing of numerous muscles, aka the muscle tenses, yes?
Mm-hmm.
If a ballerina, we hear this, if a ballerina releases all tension from her body, she will fall into a heap on the floor. So clearly there's work to be done. So there's the necessary work to accomplish the task at hand, but when it crosses that line into excess work beyond what is required, then for me, that's tension.
Yeah, right. Myth versus truth. The higher the belt, the bigger the breath.
Oh, no, thank you. That's a great recipe for vocal distress, I'm afraid. I don't think we want to create excess subglottic pressure under any high-intensity sound, really. In belt, we have a longer closed phase, which means that in each vibratory cycle, every time the chords come together and apart, the chords are together longer than they're apart. So the setup is such that we're already going to be using less air than in a classical quality. Which is why a lot of your belters will report that they feel like they could hold that note forever and ever and ever and ever, right? Mm-hmm. Taking a big breath underneath that goes back to singing 101, and I think one of the most problematic lies, well-intentioned lies that we're told in our first voice lesson, which is it's all about support, right? And if you're doing a high note of any variety, it's going to require quote-unquote support. Well, I don't disagree with that statement as it is, but we have to define support. What does support look like? And I think it really needs to be the right amount of subglottic pressure, the right amount of air pressure for the task at hand. And specific to belt, if we look at kind of its real life correlate, if I'm standing out on 46th Street here and somebody's about to get hit by a car, I'm not going to prepare to yell to them and warn them. I'm not going to prepare with a big breath. Mm-hmm. I'm going to, hey, immediate.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to use the breath that I have on hand. And I think that's what the body is set up to do. And for me, that's a big part of my philosophy in the studio. Before I give you something arbitrary and technical to accomplish, I want to look at what does your body already know how to do?
Yeah. It's that rebound.
Yes, exactly.
That we're designed to do.
Exactly.
Okay. Myth or truth? Bright, ring, twang. It's all the same as nasal.
This gets very, very confusing for a lot of folks. And there are even some teachers that I'm familiar with who will say to a singer, we need to bring it forward, so let's bring it into the nose. The truth is they are not the same thing. Nasality, as we know, is produced by the positioning of the soft palate, the velum, right? And we have our velopharyngeal port, that little doorway up into the sinus cavity. And if it's open, if we have sort of we might think of it as a lazy soft palate, mm-hmm. then we are nasal, yes? And I can do bright nasal, which in here I call the nerd voice. Or I can do bright and twangy that is not nasal, right? It's, mm-hmm. We might think of that as sort of the Ethel Merman or Al Jolson. So they're clearly two very different sounds. And and we can use them together as we do in bluegrass, for example, or pop. We hear some pop singers, Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears, who are making very gentle use of nasality to keep them thinned out. But I think it is important for singers to recognize them as two very separate ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Myth or truth? The primary role of the larynx in the body is an instrument.
I think most of us, especially in the arts, would tend to assume that the number one job of the larynx is to make sound, to communicate. But biologically, the primary role of the larynx is to act as a valve, closing off the airway when we swallow, or to help us produce, what we call the Valsalva maneuver, where we are valving, we're holding back air to increase pressure. And we do this when we give birth, we go to the bathroom, we pick up heavy suitcases. So biologically, it's very necessary. And this brings up an interesting conversation because clearly then we have the ability to use the same real estate for two separate functions, as an instrument, as a means of communication, and as a valve.
Yeah.
And the problem there is when the two get confused. And it's very easy to confuse the two when we are working too hard. If I'm pushing too much air, if I'm taking, as you say, a big breath for belting, I'm really tanking up, I'm going to send a very powerful message to my body, which is, hey, we're doing heavy lifting or we're doing a lot of work. So cords and valve, you need to valve. And we get the false folds or the vestibular folds involved at that point, and we really create a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the work of singing, especially in CCM styles, is to separate ourselves as much as we can from that valving and to really make the difference very clear.
Great. Myth or truth? The cricoid cartilage tilts.
This one's interesting because the research is still ongoing and there are still discussions being had about this. I think it was in 2005. Dr. Ingo Tietze, are you familiar with that name?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
One of our preeminent voice scientists, and we owe him a lot, truly. Mm-hmm. He invited me to come speak at his annual Summer Vocology Institute on the subject of belting. And there I am lecturing away, talking about cricoid tilt. And this comes out of the Estelle model. And the idea of the cricoid tilt is that that lower cartilage below the Adam's apple, the thyroid, would pull forward and down to open the cricothyroid visor or space. And in doing so, thicken the folds for something like belting or quote unquote mixing, right? And so I'm, happily lecturing away, and he puts up a hand and he says, nope. And I said, I'm sorry. And he said, cricoid can't tilt. And this was the first anybody had ever told me that the cricoid does not tilt. And I said, really? And he said, yes, I just did a study on this, and there is no biological function for the cricoid to tilt. There is no muscle present. And as we know, if there isn't a muscle present to do the work, it's not going to move. Also, we know that the cricoid is fixed to the tracheal ring, the top of the trachea. So there's that as well. Now, there is some thought that perhaps what we're feeling, but I got to say, for people who teach cricoid tilt, there does seem to be a very strong percept, a very strong perception that something is tilting or moving. And certainly we are seeing that space is widening. And we're thinking that perhaps what's happening is that muscles from above are in fact pulling the thyroid upward and back. So that's what's actually opening that space versus the cricoid tilting. But yeah, that's been an interesting ongoing discussion.
Yeah, I was teaching with Tom Burke, and in a course he said, maybe what's happening is that the thyroid cartilage is tilting up and back.
Yes.
What if we think about that
exactly.
instead of thinking of the cricoid tilt? So it's amazing that you just said a very similar thing.
Right. Some people are proposing that it could be the cricopharyngeus, and I don't think that seems quite as likely. But we are thinking that there are muscles that are pulling, and that's, I think, a big point of research right now is to figure out exactly what that function is.
Yeah. Myth or truth? The area epiglottic sphincter is a sphincter.
Yes. And there's still discussion going on about this. That's another big part of the Estelle model, which is, I think, not just specific to them. I believe other people are referring to the area epiglottic sphincter as well. And what we're seeing from speech pathologists, when we look at the swallowing literature, is that it is not really a sphincter at all. There's not really enough muscle tone there or muscle fibers present to narrow in and of itself, pull the epiglottis downward to create twang. That has been the primary focus of how we make that bright sound. That's what I was trained, that the sphincter narrows and it pulls the epiglottis downward, producing twang. And we're finding that actually in the swallowing literature, what's taught, because of course when we swallow, the epiglottis is pushing downward and it's covering the entrance to the larynx, the epilarynx. And so what we're finding is that in fact it's more than likely the backing of the tongue onto the epiglottis. Yeah. Wow. And we have Carrie Aubert to thank for that. She's been looking into that, and she's an Estelian herself, but she's been looking into this idea that it really, from her perspective, it can't really be a sphincter, but more than likely the tongue backing onto the epiglottis.
Excellent. Myth or truth?
Mm-hmm.
A man's falsetto is the same as head voice.
Myth. And this is confusing because falsetto is used to denote many, many things across the world. In the UK, we can get very confused discussing falsetto because it's often used in certain circles to denote what I would call head voice. For me, in my personal studio, I do as little discussion of registers as I possibly can. And the reason for that is that more than anything, I believe that the way we think about our voice is the way we're going to use it. And if I train a singer to think about chest voice, head voice, falsetto, whatever it may be, as distinct places in their voice that need joining, they're going to think of their voice a bit like a clunky stick shift, trying to get from gear to gear to gear. So for me, I actually endeavor not to talk about head voice, but falsetto for me is a distinct leftover from our boy soprano days, right? It is the remnants of those days. And it's a distinct, we have just the edge of the vocal ligament vibrating, and it's not, we can't mix it with anything. We can hear singers do very, very artful gradations where they move between falsetto and quote unquote head voice. But on some level, what we call the vibrational pattern is changing. We can't mix vibrational patterns. I tend to adhere to the model that an SLP would use, which is we talk about fry, modal voice, loft, and flageolet, or that register up there. And modal would be anything that encompasses a speech coordination, right? I could be talking up here, which some people might call a mix. But it's modal, it's all modal. And that I like for singers because it gives them this impression of anything connected to my communication, to my speech, is all living in the same world.
Yeah. I'm really, really glad that you just said all of that. I was a student that got into serious vocal troubles with the chest head mix idea. I had no idea what that meant. It was like a stick shift. I had so much manipulation. So when I started learning more about modes and modal voice, and definitely all of the idea of more twang or thinner, thick folds, that all just made so much more sense to me than chest, head, and mix. That language for me was just very, very confusing.
Yes, and there are teachers who do very, very well with it, and they like to discuss register because it comes, that's the traditional training. God knows I was trained in terms of registers to begin with. But, I have students who come in and they want to talk about, well, on this note, I'm aiming for 60% chest and 40% head. And I just think, I don't think your body knows what to do with that cue. I think you can get to the place where you have sorted out what your body's supposed to do with that cue. But I just like to take out that middleman.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to my rapid fire questions.
Ooh, exciting.
So I'm going to ask the questions and you just give a quick answer. Okay, what is some advice that you would give to an aspiring young performer?
I think I always say, if there's any other path or career you can envision making you a happy and fulfilled human being, by all means do that instead. But if this is the only thing that lights that inner fire, then commit yourself to it and to your craft with everything you've got.
Great. What is your favorite quote?
Oh, I have it framed and hanging in the studio here, actually. The great choreographer Martha Graham said it. There is a vitality, I'm reading it off the wall. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and will be lost. Isn't that amazing?
Yes. I have chills. I love that quote. I've never heard it before.
Yeah, I blew it up huge and I've got it on the wall because it just means everything.
What are your favorite song lyrics?
We sail above the weather. We search the ocean floor. We rival our creation, still yearning for more. But can we fly together, a migratory V? How wonderful if that's what God could see. I love that. And it's from Adam Guettle's Migratory V. I just adore that lyric.
It's about halfway through. I thought, I wonder if this is Adam Guettle.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Who influenced your teaching the most?
So I mentioned that during that sophomore year of college in a master class, I made, this sort of breakthrough in 15 minutes. And I'd been frustrated and working so hard. And it was that first taste of functional voice training where somebody said, not just, here's the sound I want you to make, but so here's how we make that sound. And here are the actual tensions or shortening or asymmetries in your body that are keeping you from that sound. And I will always be indebted to Dr. Melissa Maldi for that. She wrote a lovely book on body mapping, which I highly recommend for singers. And that really was the moment, I think, not instantaneous, but it was the moment that I realized, oh, this is what I'm going to do.
Does she still teach?
She does indeed. She is at the University of Northern Colorado.
Oh, what?
Yep.
What is something new about the voice that you learned this week?
Ooh, most recently. Oh, that tongue retraction, which we would ordinarily think of as tension to be avoided, is being used in the treatment of spasmodic dysphonia or tremor in Parkinson's patients to stabilize their larynx. And this is actually, we already talked about Carrie Aubert, and this is something that she's been kind of looking at. But who knew that Kermit voice, or what the Germans call, is one of my favorite German words, Knödel, it has a function. Ordinarily, we're very carefully guiding people away from that, and of course, we're still exploring it and what the boundaries are. But shout out to Carrie, who's been exploring that, and that was very fascinating to me.
Yeah, and with that demographic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't know that, so yeah. I learned it this week too.
There's a great video on it. I'll send it to you. Maybe you can link to it.
Great, I would love that. What is one voice tool you could never live without?
Oh gosh. It's like asking me to choose between my children.
Oh no. Okay, you could use two.
I'd have to say, I think clearly for me, Lesak Madsen resonant voice work, which really comes out of speech therapy work, but it is so applicable in the voice studio. Kitty Verdellini, big hats off to her for this. But she took the work of Arthur Lesak, who was a noted stage speech person, and she thought, gosh, this work has such applicable use in the therapeutic setting.
Yeah. What is one thing you have on your bucket list?
Scuba diving. Never done it. I think it looks amazing.
It's amazing.
Have you done it?
Yes, you have to do it.
I want to.
You have to do it. It'll be some of the most relaxing, incredible scenery you've ever seen in your life.
All right. Well, I'll meet you at the Hudson in 15.
We won't see anything. What is the most delightful word you can think of?
Oh, good one. Petrichor. Have you heard that word?
Petrichor.
Yeah. That is the word for that glorious, I'm kind of a word geek as well. That's the word for that glorious fresh aroma after a summer rain.
Ah.
Isn't it amazing that there's a word for that?
Yes.
Petrichor.
Petrichor. And that is what we smell?
That's what we're smelling, that earthy smell.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
What is your favorite book?
Favorite book? I'd have to say The Good Book, honestly, but I do love British comedy as well. So I highly recommend to everyone, if you're into like Monty Python, yes. British humor, highly recommend Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. It was written actually in the 19th century, but it is shockingly funny.
Okay. I'm going to have to read it because
yeah,
I do love the British humor.
Yeah.
What are you currently learning?
Acoustics, the complex interaction of source harmonics and vocal tract formants that produce a human voice. And then, delving from there into what we call psychoacoustics, which is really exploring how the ear and brain hear and ultimately shape the sound. And it's certainly not stuff that I would delve into in lessons with a student, but it has remarkable impact on how I listen to them. And I'm really very much a novice still, but I'm learning.
Psychoacoustics.
Right?
That sounds
Petty stuff.
You're just making me want to. Now I have so many more things I have to learn.
Great. That's inspiring in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. What do you wish you would have learned sooner?
That's an easy one. I wish I'd learned sooner about the non-linear coupling of the folds and the vocal tract. Are you familiar with that idea?
No.
We all tend to think of the instrument as being a one-way street. The chords produce a buzzy signal that's rich in harmonics, and then the vocal tract above resonates and filters it. And that's true. It's a very simplified way of thinking about it. But for me, learning that what occurs in the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx above the folds can have tremendous backward impact, both positive and negative, on the vibration of the folds themselves. That was a huge game changer in my teaching and in my singing. That's another thing that we really do, I think, in many ways owe to Dr. Tietze.
So I'm assuming that's part of what he's doing with semi-occluded vocal tract exercises?
That's exactly where the research went as soon as he discovered this. Yes, that if we're not thinking about the instrument as being linear, then what we do, building up pressure, we talk about convergent vocal tract shapes. What we do above has enormous impact backward.
Mm-hmm. So that was the finding that led him to look at it as a pressure system.
Absolutely. And he was interested in what if we artificially build up pressure, say with a straw, where we're also not just building up pressure, but we're elongating the tube. We're adding 6-7 inches to our tube. And what does that accomplish for the instrument? And so we owe a lot to him for that, that's for sure.
Yeah. Wow, excellent. So I knew the findings. I just didn't know where they came from and how it all came to be.
Every day in the studio, a big part of my work is really just taking that idea and helping it, without going into that with the student. It's pretty heady stuff. But how do we take that idea and make your singing easier? How do we create that convergent vocal tract shape? How do we shape the tongue in a way that's going to make that belting easy to do, right? And all of this is stuff that happens above the chords that's having tremendous backward impact.
Yeah. Mike, this has been an absolute pleasure. If the listeners want to get in touch with you, if they want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Oh, I'd love to hear from them through my website, probably mikeruckles.com, or they can find the studio pages on either Facebook or Instagram, certainly.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for doing Myth versus Truth and some debunking, and for your love of learning and your continuation of learning. We're really lucky in the community to have some very special people in New York City who all continue to love to learn. And so as students, those are very, very lucky students that get some phenomenal teachers that just are continuously on that track of bringing in more knowledge and information to just better the students even more. And you obviously are among them and one of the top knowledge seekers. So I love it.
Isn't it a great community that we're in? It really is.
We are very blessed. Yes.
We are.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your colleagues, your students, and your friends. Please subscribe, rate us, and write a review. You can find us on Facebook at Lifelight Massage, and you can also check out my website at lifelightmassage.com. Please join me next week for another wonderful conversation on the visceral voice.